social media, community digital engagement, and collaboration. And once again, we have a panel of witnesses that will be presenting oral testimony before this body. Are you ready, Hassan? You ready to go? Okay.
Yes,
We're
sir.
going to start with our first presenter, Hassan Aden, Director, Research and Programs for the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Hassan?
Commissioner Ramsey, Professor Robinson, Director Davis, and members of the task force, thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Hassan Aden, and I'm the former Chief of Police for the Greenville, North Carolina Police Department, and now the Director of Research and Programs at the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the IACP. Social media for the 21st Century Police Agency isn't about whether to use Facebook or Instagram or what song parodies tend to go viral. Social media today is about knowing your constituents and using the proper tools to their fullest extent to open two-way conversation and communication with those who live, work, and visit your community. The IACP supports these efforts through the IACP Center for Social Media, which provides training and resources to build the capacity of law enforcement to use social media to prevent and solve crimes, strengthen police community relations, and enhance services. I attended one of the center's trainings 6 months before I became Chief of Police. And I did that with countless other law enforcement executives and officers who have benefited from the resources the center provides, especially when you're getting to that level and you come into a new city and you need to learn that community and engage that community. Social media allows law enforcement agencies to reach a broad, diverse audience quickly and in an unfiltered manner. These platforms also allow police to reach out in conversational ways, eliminating jargon and stereotypes, and creating open lines of communication that reach beyond online platforms and into face-to-face interactions. By using these tools thoughtfully, agencies develop new levels of transparency and provide exceptional customer service, thereby enhancing relationships with individuals, businesses, and organizations throughout their community. Law enforcement agencies should not wait until there's an issue in their community to begin engaging through social media platforms. It is important that agencies begin using social media sooner rather than later, but thoughtfully, by articulating a strategy and developing policy. IACP has created a model policy and has numerous resources to help agencies ask the right questions and take the appropriate steps in crafting a comprehensive strategy that's integrated with their overall communications plan and with all agency operations. The plan may change, but being in touch with their community will help agencies continue to adapt and evolve in a positive manner. When I first assumed the role of chief in Greenville, I found the morale was low, the crime rate was unacceptable, and relationships with some elected officials, the news media, and community members were in need of repair. On day one, I met with the local news outlets and established an expectation of inclusion and transparency. We used informative messaging, listening to what the community wanted from us to build transparency. We established Twitter town halls where officers from various units shared pictures and answered questions about their role in the department and in the community. We also did tweet-alongs where we provided followers with a virtual ride-along experience. Using social media, we were able to create opportunities for people to interact with us in ways that the public almost never gets. We consistently receive responses, great responses, positive responses, to our social media efforts. When I left Greenville 2 years later to join the IACP, there was a 13% reduction in violent crime, 5% reduction in property crime, but something that's really not measurable, or it is actually measurable if you take a look, is community satisfaction. The community loved its police department because we reached out and we engaged. To produce the best and most useful resources to help agencies like mine, IACP works with local law enforcement agencies and brings in visiting fellows who provide valuable insight and help guide projects and programs. This past year, Lieutenant Zachary Perron from the Palo Alto, California Police Department joined the IACP team as a fellow. When the Palo Alto police recently had a protest in their city, they deployed a well-developed communications plan that had a strong social media component. The Palo Alto police started a day with a tweet to all their followers that included the hashtag being used by the demonstrators. They indicated that the protest was happening and that they looked forward to working with the protesters toward a peaceful demonstration. As the events stayed nonviolent, the Palo Alto police repeatedly used the word peaceful in their messages to describe the event and the participants. Groups involved in the protest engaged with the police department, retweeting some of the department's messaging and including the Palo Alto Police Department in their own tweets and the hashtags. Protesters, at the end of the day, thanked the Palo Alto Police Department for their professional response and noted their appreciation for the terminology they used throughout that day. This strategy of using strong, positive messaging, communicating early and often, and engaging participants has been successfully replicated and is something that all agencies can utilize. In my written testimony, you will find several other examples, and on the IACP Center for Social Media websites, there are countless others. Agencies can and do learn so much from each other to help them to build an effective social media presence and enhance their offline relationships with the community. Agencies should not miss an opportunity to show their communities that they are present and working hard to protect and serve all individuals. Social media is just one more way that agencies can keep their presence known and constantly share information and the status of any situation of compelling public interest. A strong social media presence benefits both agency and community in good times and in difficult times by increasing transparency and building trust. With a thoughtful and inclusive approach and attention to strategy and policy, law enforcement agencies and communities of all sizes and types will likely find success using social tools. Thank you for convening this listening session and for allowing the International Association of Chiefs of Police to express its views and share some examples from agencies across the country. Thank you.
And thank you. Next, we will hear from Mr. DeRay McKesson from This Is the Movement.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. And I don't think you have my bio. I'm a protester, and I'm one of the protesters who use social media to mobilize and to get the protests going and keeping them sustained. So before I started protesting, I had about 900 followers on Twitter. Today, I have about 65,000. I also manage one of the newsletters that goes out from the protest community. We distribute it to about 14,000 people. Right before the no indictment of Darren Wilson, we had people sign up for a text message alert to get the notice, and about 21,000 people signed up. So I'm here representing the protest community and also those of us who use social media. So I began protesting in Ferguson in August 2014 and continue to this day. Tweets, Vines, and Instagram videos were our call to action, and it was our way to bear witness. I think about the very first picture that I ever saw of a protest. It was of a woman with her fist up, and behind her were officers with armed, they had like machine guns. They looked like machine guns. They had tanks, or not tanks, they were Humvees. When we say tanks, people get real riled up. So I remember that photo. I remember the first video that I saw of Mike Brown's mother crying when she saw his body out there on the ground on Canfield. Twitter and Instagram were ways for us to communicate with each other and also to show the evil that we face. So in St. Louis, there have been many times where we have faced the police in peaceful protest where they have been aggressive towards us. So I, like many others, have been tear gassed. I've had non-lethal weapons pointed at me by officers. It was illegal to stand still on American soil. We've been pepper sprayed, all for engaging in peaceful protest. I remember the first time that 4 officers approached me and said, you must keep walking, you can't stand still, and you can't pace the same area. And I remember tweeting it, and those tweets actually became evidence used in the federal trial that we had in St. Louis that made the 5-second rule unconstitutional. In no uncertain terms, Twitter saved our lives. If it were not for the tweets and Vines, Missouri would have convinced you and the rest of the world that we didn't exist, but we had the tools to tell our own stories. In Blackness, we have faced erasure in so many ways, and what's been powerful about Twitter is that everybody gets to tell the story of what's happening, and we were able to tell it real time, and people listened. And we talk about protest often being confrontation, protest is disruption, and the protests continue because we continue to see that the injustice continues with no accountability, which is why we continue to talk about it. I'm proud to see a fellow protester, Brittany Packnett, here on the panel because it demonstrates this task force commitment to involving the voices of the people who made this conversation about police brutality a national issue. I'm here to talk also about like the things that you can do in the space that you have in terms of making recommendations. So the first is drafting and introducing national guidance to be distributed to all police departments and municipalities that receive federal funding that clearly state that we have the right to film the police. It is something that across the country is not being adhered to. There are times in my own life when we were in St. Louis where we would put our cameras up and the police would they would shine flashlights in our cameras so that we couldn't film them, right? And that happens in too many places across the country. If this is something that is actually right, we anticipate that it will be followed through. The second thing is about officers clearly showing their badges. So in many instances, to this day, officers don't have their badges. And what they'll say is that like it can't go over, my police vest, my bulletproof vest covers the badge, or the jacket that I'm wearing today covers the badge. And we feel like we should be able to know who the police are that are policing us. The third is for the Department of Justice, in conjunction with community organizations and local law enforcement, to develop virtual and in-person training modules whose use is mandatory by all police departments receiving federal funding, that focuses on implicit bias, both recognizing bias and accounting for bias, and that has specific sections that address shooter bias and decisions related to non-white persons of interest. Ultimately, we believe that police officers who, despite their best efforts, show significant shooter bias in these trainings should not be deployed to Black and brown communities. Fourth, the request is for the task force to recommend the inclusion of a question that explicitly asks youth whether the police in their community make them feel safe, or a question akin to this on the National Youth Risk Behavior Survey that is distributed to most high school and many middle school students each year. This would be an important first step in collecting national data that can be segmented across lines of race, gender, and a host of other demographic indicators about the perceptions of American policing by youth. Currently, we still don't know which police departments make youth feel safe and which do not. Collecting this data is essential to identifying the policies and practices that can improve police relations with the youth they're responsible for protecting and serving. And fifth, the tools that we have to communicate with each other in 2015 are unprecedented and importantly rely on the internet. Twitter and other social media tools were pivotal to the protest community in highlighting the American horror story that is police brutality in Black communities. To this end, it is important that the task force firmly make recommendations that affirm net neutrality. This may seem to be an odd request, but our ability to communicate with each other can be willfully stifled by companies and organizations that do not have an interest in social justice or that actively work against issues facing Black America and communities of color in general. The current freedom of the internet allows us to use this public good for the common good. And the last thing I'll talk about is something that I heard on the last panel, was this idea that tweeting police departments and police departments that use Facebook actually add to connective tissue of trust in communities of color or with young people. And that has not been my experience. So in St. Louis, what we saw Chief Dotson live tweet the protests, right? So he would live tweet what we were doing. When one night he said, "The protesters threw rocks at me." That is what he tweeted. So we're like, we didn't throw rocks at you. We did not throw rocks at you. And in St. Louis, if we had thrown rocks at the police chief, you would never see me again. You wouldn't see any of us. It would be a whole different day in St. Louis. And then later, he released a public statement saying it was only one rock that was thrown, and he hasn't talked about it publicly since. But that tweet was really damaging to any sort of trust that we might have had with Chief Dotson at that time. And that was actually very early on in the protests in Shaw in St. Louis City, where he is in charge of. The second thing is we saw the St. Louis County PD make a joke about Tamir Rice's killing, right? So they made a joke about young people and making sure that you don't give kids guns. And that was so insensitive that I'll never forget that tweet. And they subsequently took it down and they apologized about it. But we are really conscious that we protest because people have been killed, and this is not a joke, right? And we protest because the injustice that we continue to face is so real, and we protest in the honor of Mike Brown and Tamir Rice and Vondera and Antonio and Isaac and Rakia and Renisha and Oscar and so many people that continue to die with no sense of justice. So I would say that, if you can do anything, you can potentially support guidance that goes out to police departments around the do's and don'ts about how to engage. But in my experience, I've seen the police department actually make the situations more aggressive. And most recently, Sheriff Clark in Milwaukee, you should just check out his Twitter feed, because it is this incredible, aggressive tone that he takes towards the protest community that should not be okay, but it is. So thank you for allowing me to come today and talk. And again, this is the 176th day of protest. The protest will continue until we see some semblance of justice.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony. Next, we'll turn to Mr. Steve Spyker, Research and Technology Director, Urban Strategies Council.
Thank you. Dear members of the task force and community leaders in the room today, I'm speaking today on behalf of Urban Strategies Council, a 28-year-old social injustice organization from Oakland, California, where I've had the privilege of being the Director of Research and Technology for almost 8.5 years. And I'm also here on behalf of Open Oakland, a civic innovation organization I co-founded with Eddie Tejeda a few years ago. My work at the Council has given me the opportunity to see how a lack of transparency in local government impacts data-driven decision-making, government technology, and community engagement. I've had the chance to work with many local agencies and community organizations to help them unearth their valuable data, to analyze it, to put it in context, and help them to communicate the story and the impact of that data. Traditionally, the role of government has been perceived as a collector of data for compliance and for regulatory reporting purposes, yet this is no longer sufficient in our view of a 21st century government. Government now needs to be proactive across all agencies, especially those that have traditionally been closed and inaccessible. For many years, we've been unearthing public data for research purposes and publishing these data openly for all to access. We obtained data on probation populations, crime reports, foreclosure filings, and when we obtained both open and private data on foreclosure filings in Oakland, we found that there was a massive increase in acquisition by private investors, and we published that report for the public with the raw data so people could evaluate that. And what we saw was that that report sparked off new regulations to protect tenants in Oakland. It sparked off new regulations to require tracking of activity so our communities would be informed about what was happening. We put public data in the hands of the community, and really powerful things started to happen. We led an effort to crowdsource legislation for open data in Oakland, and now we have local agencies making open data, making data accessible to the public free of charge and without restriction. And this has led to really breakthrough innovations such as openbudgetoakland.org, which, when we showed it to our city council, led to disbelief. They'd never seen their own city budget in a context that they can understand. And this led to communities across Oakland understanding a complex city budget, 16,000 lines of data for the very first time, and being able to put that in context. And we had open data to make that possible, and we had respectful collaborations with the community. We had hackers, city staff, and advocates working together to produce things that government alone could not produce. Another example of what happens when government opens up data is our earthquake safety app, softstory.openoakland.org. We took public data and we helped build a tool to inform low-income communities, low-income renters, if they were living in buildings that were susceptible to damage and collapse in an earthquake. And this was only something that was possible when government opened up its data and then collaborated respectfully with community organizations and hackers. You'll notice I haven't talked about great policing collaboration examples, and for good reason. Despite Oakland generating a near real-time flow of crime reports, ours and other local police departments and sheriffs haven't been eager to jump on the idea of open data yet. And given the lack of trust we have in Oakland's police department, the need for real community policing, and a dearth of accessible information about policing practices and incidents, Oakland is like many other U.S. law enforcement agencies in its need to embrace open data and to adopt respectful collaborations and engagements that can lead to innovation and change. Given the way communities of color are impacted by crime and violence and the number of officer-involved shootings and assaults on officers, there's a very real opportunity for data to be leveraged for their benefit. Right now, there are activist groups building databases of all officer-involved shootings and homicides in the country, and these are duplicated efforts. They cost hundreds of hours of community time to build them. Projects like Oakland's Shine in Peace, KilledByPolice.net, and FatalEncounters.org. These projects should be taken as a leading indicator of a huge and growing demand for better transparency in law enforcement. Citizens are clamoring for data to inform decision-making, policy development, reform, and civic action. When communities across the country need to collect news reports of officer-involved shootings and homicides, something is wrong. When stop and frisk data are hidden from public view and are not available for community research and analysis, something is missing. When arrest information only sees sunlight in the form of aggregate annual reports, something is missing. That something will be realized when law enforcement adopts a policy of open by default and begins publishing, with some obvious legal restrictions, record-level data on crime reports, arrests, uses of force, weapons discharges, and stop and frisk incidents. As individuals, we don't trust that which we cannot see. Publishing data alone will not lead to better science operations, and it's not a silver bullet to restoring community trust in the police departments. However, in publishing these data on an ongoing basis, we make possible new productive collaborations, new opportunities to engage with somewhat objective truths to work from, and we allow for innovations that we couldn't predict. My recommendation to this task force is make open data by default the new norm for our police forces. Support the open publishing of these data, and support the adoption of new data standards for consistency across cities, and support those agencies taking a lead role to learn together and to work towards common goals, towards a future where transparency is no longer a laughable concept when it comes to law enforcement, where communities can trust the information coming out of police databases, and where residents can see and understand problems and patterns for themselves. Then we can have informed debates and start remaking policing in the U.S. in the ways that we agree on. Thank you.
And thank you for your testimony. And our last witness for today is Ms. Lori Stevens, founder and principal consultant, Laws Communication. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, members of the task force, and Chairs Ramsey and Lori Robinson. Thank you. Director Davis, it's always a pleasure. I'm very pleased to be here today, but not just because this is my topic, but I truly believe that none of us would be here if it weren't for social media. If we get this right, we could have a greater impact today as a result of this few hours that we've been here than many of us have had over the last several years of work. And when I say none of us would be here if it weren't for social media, while that may be radical to some, I truly believe it's true. And anybody who doesn't get that, I think you should throw in the towel. I really do. Within 24 hours of the incident in Ferguson, approximately 140,000 tweets had been sent, eventually reaching the rate of about 6,000 a minute. And within 5 days, there were more than 3.6 million tweets about Ferguson. Controversial events like police use of force, officer-involved shootings, were something we didn't really hear about when they happened before in a large scale. The same is true for the really great work that police do as well. It went largely unnoticed beyond the neighborhood or town that it happened within. It's because of the existence of social media and the somewhat sophisticated use of it by citizens, activists, other observers, that the incidents in Ferguson and New York and Cleveland and everywhere else that we're aware of them. And only if we acknowledge that power and therefore we are here because of it, we will truly understand the importance of its role in policing. For community engagement, for reputation management, and to prevent and solve crime. My work centers around helping police realize the full breadth and depth of social media. Far too few agencies are doing either nothing, or they're using social media, or if they have a Twitter account, they call it doing social, you know? Social media and open data is increasing accountability all across government, and therefore the need for transparency from law enforcement in all areas of government. It has given people a larger voice. Social media, and it's just the latest evolution in communication technology. Therefore, police can and should be just as effective and impactful as any other group in its use. I think social media makes police uncomfortable because of the culture of social media is completely counter to the culture of policing. Policing is hierarchical. Social media is flat. Policing being paramilitary. With social media, everyone at all levels has an equal voice. And it's just as big at the bottom as it is at the top. But the police profession, all branches of the government for that matter, stands to gain more from proactive and strategic use of social media than even a major corporation, in my opinion. Because when it comes to the marketing and the whole public relations piece of life, police agencies aren't accustomed to operating in that way. So the gap is bigger to begin with. Add to that the groups of great concern to police and Homeland Security have become very effective at recruiting terrorists, at domestic terrorist groups, anti-policing groups, protesters, whomever. A social media study by Accenture found that 88% of the citizens you serve want to help you prevent and solve crime. Commissioner Ramsey, I'd ask you to imagine if any time you needed something, you could count on 88% of the population of Philadelphia to be standing by. And I know you understand that in Philly, because Philly does a really outstanding job at social media, Philly PD. In fact, one of the best recent examples of this was when there was a couple of gay men beaten in Philadelphia, and the commissioner's communications teams put it out on social media, and they literally handed those investigators the suspects within a couple hours. Yeah. That's right. And social media is also very effective at mass demonstrations and large events, as it will be tomorrow when the Pats beat the Seahawks. That was for Bill. But also to inject public safety messages into the conversation, to correct misinformation and rumors, in active shooter events, to manage officer safety and keep the public safe, in missing persons, and obviously in investigations. But social media integration in the police agency takes strong leadership from police commanders. Basically, lead, follow, or get out of the way. You have to accept social media. You have to let the people who know what they're doing do it. You have to take it seriously, fund it, staff it, make it a priority. The influence of police culture, I think, is essential to understand here. Social media came seemingly fast, but we should also realize that communications philosophers like Marshall McLuhan predicted this in the 1960s. Ted Nelson in 1974 wrote a book. If you want to understand democracy in the future, you must understand computers now. This didn't just happen overnight. Police leaders also need to understand the perils of no comment, especially today. As fast as social media operates, you have to say something, and then you have to say something as often, as much as you can, as often as you can, as soon as you can, when something happens. No comment has no place in our world anymore. I think there's a hesitance to accept what we don't understand. We wouldn't have a policy, for example, against picking up the telephone today. I tell my police commander clients that when they were rookie cops, their commanders probably looked at them and said, you know, we can't allow Charles Ramsey to have email, he can't be trusted, you know? And it seemed like your colleagues are now looking down and going, well, we can't trust that guy with Twitter. It's just the latest evolution in communication technology, and we have to accept that. And we need to provide, you need to provide, commanders need to provide guidance in the way of encouragement and structure through training and policy. My observation in the last several years of looking at this has been that the police, most often the police officers who get themselves into trouble are the ones whose agencies provide no guidance and no training. Police leaders should also not overreact when something bad happens, because mistakes are going to be made. The policies needed are communications policy, the on-duty, the off-duty. And don't just take somebody's model policy and just say, here, put your name on it, it's our policy. They all have to be crafted to the culture of your agency, the culture of your city, the culture of your part of the world. You need an investigations policy. I know investigators who are using free internet from the house next door because their tech department took theirs away. Yikes, that's really scary to me. Or investigators who are creating fake profiles to go undercover without any supervision or authorization. You need a cyber vetting policy so that when you are investigating potential new hires, you are being consistent about it. If there's somebody in a protected class, are you walling that off from the person who's making the hiring decisions? And there's all kinds of more reasons why you need a cyber vetting policy. And you need a data retention policy because it's a federal law to store social media records, because social media are public records. American police leaders also need to accept that some of the best work in social media in policing is happening outside of the United States. I run an awards program for 3 years now, and just under 1/3 of the winners have come from this country. The other great work is happening in the United Kingdom, Australia, Finland, Netherlands, New Zealand. In conclusion, the policing profession is at a point where the theory of community policing is not only possible like never before, but it is inevitable. There's no turning back. The question is only whether the community involvement and participation is completed truly in partnership between citizens and police. Or is it going to be with great conflict, as we've seen? In order for there to be a partnership, the police must embrace social media strategically and proactively and immerse the entire, it's my opinion, but the entire police agency at every operational level into the new open source communication landscape. Police leaders who don't understand this, in my opinion, should just step aside. Police departments need to understand the depth of what can be achieved by monitoring social media 24/7 with platforms that were specifically designed for police intelligence gathering, not commercial tools.
Could
And
you wrap
also,
it up, Ms. Stevens? You're about close, about 10 seconds left.
okay. The Presidential Task Force on 21st Century Policing and all involved should accept that social media is no utopia, but without clear acceptance and understanding of how people use social media and expect their police to use social media, it simply will not succeed. Thank you for this opportunity.
And thank you, and thank all of you for your testimony. I'm going to now turn to task force members for questions, starting with Brian Stevenson, followed by Sean Smoot.
I have just two questions. Mr. McKesson made some really interesting observations, and I wanted to ask you, Mr. Aden, where the IACP is on a couple of these issues. This question of educating departments or having clear policies to not disrupt observers when police are engaged in enforcement who are using phones, smartphones, et cetera. Have you all taken a clear position on that? And related to that, is there also training being done at your level on how officers and those who tweet can use that medium in a way that builds and restores trust and confidence rather than undermines it in the way that Mr. McKesson was talking about? And my other question, if anybody else can take on, is we've been struggling all day with this question about the trade-offs between open data systems and the privacy rights that are implicated in that. And I'd be interested in hearing where you come down on that issue, because a lot of people are brought into public scrutiny against their will because they're being stopped or interacted with by police departments, and that can be highly revealing and embarrassing, et cetera. And so I'd be interested in hearing how you resolve that tension as you make these calls for open data.
So let me begin, Mr. Stevenson. The International Association of Chiefs of Police right now has a project that is looking at that specific issue of the videotaping of police. The research isn't complete yet. We're gathering a lot of information. There's also a movement in police organizations to inform their rank and file members of what the laws are in terms of, the legality of videotaping police. So in my experience as a police chief, every member of the Greenville, North Carolina Police Department understands that not only if there is a camera in front of you videotaping you, but there are ATM machines. There, in the city of Greenville, we've got over 400 public cameras, so you're almost always on tape. But the confrontation begins, as DeRay stated, and we were talking earlier, when you're face-to-face and the situation's tense and somebody takes out a video and begins to videotape you. So there's a lot of work being done in that area because that really ties to lots of the things that we've been talking about, not just on this panel, but surrounding legitimacy and what leads to use of force. So we hope to have something soon that we can put out far and wide, because it is an important thing to start training officers right from the academy. It's a changed world, and everyone has a video camera.
Thank you very much. Sean Smoot, followed by Cedric Alexander.
Mr. Commissioner, could I just get a response on that?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Thank you. Yeah, Oakland has a big privacy-concerned community. There has been a very positive attempt by the city to actually bring in community members to develop a privacy policy for the city surveillance system, which is being used in the port, and that's a positive direction for us. There are tons of really good examples of how to manage the release of sensitive information in a way that doesn't violate anyone's rights. Every state has some different law. New York City, for example, had released all the parking ticket data with license plates, but it doesn't allow you to identify the person. So there are ways to achieve certain things that wouldn't be legal in some other states necessarily. For example, with stop and frisk data, the Oakland Police Department takes down on paper, very efficiently, obviously, everyone that was in the vehicle, ethnicity, age, things like that about who they pulled over, why they pulled them over, what they thought was going on. And it's very easy to release that information digitally, leaving out any personally identifiable information. So the amount of information that's been pumped out of many cities, New York and Chicago and San Francisco are leading on that. It's very, very straightforward for the data geeks of the world to deal with taking out sensitive information in a way that doesn't actually violate anyone's rights and privacy issues. And I think it's also a really strong opportunity to start a new debate in every community about what that means, because there's a lot of things that are legally public that, because you can now get them very easily in bulk online, it creates a very different set of circumstances around the presumption of access to my information. And that's actually a debate that isn't really being had. And by starting to actually look at policies to how we do this and why we do this, it gives a great opportunity to start to talk with people and say, we can actually legally do this. What does that mean for you? Because the victim's rights and the suspect, they all have different sets of rights. And that's something that hasn't been taken into consideration very well with access to law enforcement data yet. But there's a really big opportunity to actually start doing that.
Okay, thank you very much. Sean Smoot, followed by Cedric Alexander.
So one thing I just wanted to mention, Illinois just passed a statute last year that basically alleviates municipal governments, state and local government, from having to answer FOIA requests if they post the information online. And so I suspect you'll see a lot, you may get your wish, Mr. Spyker, about getting a lot of information, because it alleviates the burden for them to have to gather the data and copy it and provide it. I'd be interested in getting your thoughts about accountability in terms of information that people disseminate via social media, because it seems to me that just as much, in some instances, maybe more of the information that gets disseminated to literally with the push of a button, as you said, to thousands, tens of thousands of people, is not accurate information. And we see this all the time with hoaxes on Facebook, and there's whole websites devoted now to kind of answering those things. What are your thoughts about that? And Ms. Stevens, I was really hoping to get your answer on that.
About the amount of information that's put out there?
Just the accountability for people that use this to disseminate incorrect information, maybe for a criminal purpose, maybe just for fun.
Well, I think we're all over the map there. I mean, when there's an incident that happens, a large amount of the information that goes out is kind of a knee-jerk reaction, and there's a lot of power that's felt by being anonymous or not being such a big player, and obviously police aren't able to do anything in a knee-jerk way. They have to be very measured and all of that, and so there's that sort of pull and push thing going on. But with regard to investigations, it's open source, it's out there, and I think there's a reluctance on the part of the public to accept the fact that it's out there, it's open, it's, and because there's a lot of debate on whether or not police should be surveilling, social media in aggregate. I don't see the issue there. I suspect Ray does.
Yeah, I just say that the thing about misinformation is that the reason that we distrust for cause, right? Like, we're not distrustful just because we woke up upset with the police. We distrust because, I think about St. Louis is a great example with that, the rock throwing thing, is that Chief Dotson said we threw rocks at him, like plural. And then later he's like, it was just one baseball-sized rock. So when he tweets now, we question all of it because I personally saw him lie to us, right? And and my story is not unique, right? Like, there are many people who feel like this. So I get you. I do think there's something interesting about like the way we can have a message just go viral really quickly and it can replicate really quickly. But I would push you to say that like, that wouldn't be as dangerous if people trusted more and had reason to trust, right? But we have reason not to. And I think about Antonio Martin when he got killed in St. Louis. And what Chief Belmar said is that he's like, I'm going to release a high-resolution image that has like the image of the gun. That is what he said at the press conference. He released 3 videos that don't show us any gun and no picture. So when we look back at Chief Belmar, we're like, Chief, you said it. Like, we didn't ask you for it. You said you were going to do it, and you didn't, right? And at that same at another press conference, somebody said, well, what did Antonio steal? Because he was stopped for stealing. And the police chief said, and I quote, "I don't know off the top of my head." And we're like, what is going on, right? So like the distrust is for cause.
Let me just quickly respond to your first piece. Oakland, for example, has a phenomenally effective public records request system for the first time in its history, developed about a year and a half ago. And it's transforming how people access government information, it's reducing staff workload, and it's also helping build trust because you've got a way to actually see what you can ask for and how to get it. And if other people are making requests, you can also see what they've asked for. You don't see their name, but you see that someone else asked for the exact same information. 80% of the requests are going to the OPD, and because the city's actually built a good technology platform that's open source, they can actually track it for the first time and understand how much time they're putting into this, but they are also publishing raw data, which alleviates a lot of the public records requests as well. So starting to make government look and feel and work more transparently actually does make a difference as far as workload, as far as trust. And those things are really important together. The access to data, easy access to public records, knowing what you can ask for and how to get it, and also just making information easily available in general, which is not the case.
Okay, Cedric Alexander, followed by Brittany Packnett.
Mr. Chairman, my question got answered. Thank you.
Thank you, Brittany.
Great, thank you for your testimony. So I want to ask a question that goes toward building trust, and I think that this has been discussed a bit throughout the day. But I would love for you all to discuss if you have experienced or witnessed one of two things, and then what your kind of policy suggestions are at the federal level, at the local level, at the agency level around how to solve for this. Because I think that we have seen consistently sometimes the very thin line between transparency and targeting crossed. So earlier there was discussion of the video that was released of the officer being killed. I know for a fact a lot of young people of color via the "If They Gun Me Down" hashtag on Twitter feel as though they would be targeted if they were the victims, right? So we saw the release of Michael Brown in the Ferguson Market moments prior to his killing, and a lot of questioning as to why that video was released and went viral, given the fact that he was a target, right? So this line between transparency and actually re-victimizing or targeting the victim. And then also the line between intelligence gathering and targeting proven nonviolent peaceful protesters, right? And so we've talked a lot about how law enforcement agencies can actively use Twitter and other social media agents, but I think we are beholden to discuss how social media activity is observed in communities, and ensuring that people, while there is intelligence gathering happening, that people that have proven to be nonviolent, that have proven to continue to be peaceful protesters, are not targeted. And so I want to hear if either of those things have been experienced in anyone's engagement with this issue, and then what policy recommendations you have around making sure that those two lines are not crossed.
That's a lot of questions. I'll take a first stab at it if I may. I think to your first point and to the chief, regarding the chief who tweeted somebody threw rocks at him, things like that, I think that that's an unfortunate incident, and the outcome wasn't so positive, probably because, I'm guessing, I don't know that situation, but there was no build-up, there was no building of relationship up until that point. When these events happen, people tend to all of a sudden jump into social media and start blurting things out there. Police agencies especially need to understand that you got to build these relationships before you need them. Which if you're going to engage those 88%, you have to be out there. You have to be engaged with your public. You have to have at least made an attempt to build the trust. And then that way, when you need the people to help you, they will help you. That has been my experience. I think there's many examples of that. But I think the main point I wanted to make there is you can't just do it on the fly. And then as far as monitoring social media activity, I think there's a difference between whether somebody's being targeted and when the monitoring is going on and when it's being done in aggregate. And I've had people say, well, on the other, the other argument on the other side of the fence, argue one is okay and not the other, and vice versa. Whatever. I think my only experience that I've ever seen police monitor a specific individual or individuals is when they have cause to believe they need to do that. Other than that, innocent law-abiding citizens, my observation has only been that they're monitored in aggregate. In other words, you're using a social media monitoring tool and you're putting in certain keywords, or you may draw a geofence around this building and just see what's being said on a certain topic at a certain time, and you're not necessarily looking at any one individual or individuals. So, and in fact, that argument is why I also make the argument that there should be policy in all of these areas as well. Yeah.
So I'll briefly, just respectfully disagree about the part about building relationships. Like, Chief Dotson should tell the truth whether he knows me or not, right? That there's something so fundamental about truth telling, especially with law enforcement who has the responsibility to protect and serve, and also the power to kill, that like you should actually tell the truth whether you've done the community building. If you do the community building, that's like an added bonus, and that we should all, like, that should be powerful too, but the truth should be something that we should not negotiate with.
I don't disagree with that, absolutely.
The other thing that I'd say in response to your second point, Ms. McNutt, is about the targeting. So I personally have blocked about 10,000 people on Twitter. The police in St. Louis know me by name, so when we go places, they're like, "You're D-Ray." My name is DeRay, and they call me D-Ray, which is how I know they only know me from Twitter. And there is this really interesting thing, right? Because when I get death threats, and I get a fair number of them, my home address is now public. There are very few things about me that aren't now public because of the protests. And it's this weird thing where I don't feel I can go to the DOJ because they told the police officers to wear name badges, and they're not doing that. So if the DOJ can tell police to wear, like, put nameplates on, and they don't do it, then I don't think the DOJ can protect me. And then the St. Louis PD is, they are the people who are being aggressive towards us, right? So I'm in this really interesting space of, like, I know people say they want to kill me, right? So they'll put pictures on Twitter of, like, my name in crosshairs or things like that. But then it's like, well, where do you go? So people are like, DeRay, you should report it. And it's like, well, who am I going to report it to? I don't know. Like, I'll just tweet about it and hope that that is protection enough, right? And I'm no longer afraid, but it is this interesting thing about, like, what is the role of the police, or who polices the police, right? This thing about, like, being targeted. So I'll just offer that.
I'll take a stab at the targeting one also. And I think that because all of these social media platforms are inexpensive and free, a lot of people get on them before receiving proper training, proper guidance, and developing policy. In a well-managed social media plan, a media plan, there are policies and there are expectations. There are also, it's clearly communicated why you're doing certain things. And when you have that, you also understand that before putting something out, you must consider the good, the bad, and the ugly with that, the unintended consequences. So I think if you look around and you look at police departments, and I'll give you some examples of some that do an outstanding job, yet they seem like to have hundreds of people tweeting within the department. The Austin Police Department, for instance, that's in my written testimony. Philadelphia Police Department, Palo Alto Police Department, Prince George's County, Maryland. There are countless police departments that understand this and have taken the time to establish accountability for the tweets, yet let it get out to accomplish its mission with trained people that understand exactly what you're talking about, because it can have a very negative impact if done irresponsibly.
And just to back up Mr. McKesson's point as well, it's great when you have positive interactions on social media, building of trust, and officers that are active in using Twitter, for example, in the middle of protests. But any of that goodwill and that trust is just destroyed instantly if, like Oakland, you then go and violate your crowd control policies, and all of a sudden the trust that you may have built up, all of a sudden the positive interactions on Twitter, they're gone because you've then suddenly started treating people like animals. So it's important to have that trust build up and to use social media actively as officers, yes. But everything else you do also matters. So Twitter isn't like an absent universe removed from real life. Things that happen in real life have to actually relate. And so if you're building trust on one level and destroying it elsewhere, you're just destroying it. And so it's really important to be consistent at every level. I think, to Mr. Aden's point, there's a thing we haven't discussed yet about risk aversity in government. And we all know government is risk averse. And giving a bunch of your line staff and your sworn officers permission to tweet is a risk management issue that's very, very uncomfortable for a lot of people, and we've got to accept that that is a piece of this equation, that government and law enforcement has to get better at managing its internal risk and accepting that it's got to accept some level of risk because you want to empower more officers to talk. That's a level of risk, and we've got to actually be prepared to do that.
Thank you very much. Sean Smoot.
I'm going to ask this to Mr. Aden, and maybe somebody else would have an answer, but, you know, we have about 18,000 police departments across the United States, and a vast majority of those are very small, certainly smaller than 50 officers. And so, you know, what recommendation could you make in terms of social media utilization and monitoring policies along those lines for those departments that really don't have additional manpower to devote to this kind of thing?
When we did our, the IACP did its, it was a survey in 2014 that surveyed exactly, you know, that was one of the questions, was what limitations do you find? And it went out to its membership. The resources were the biggest reason why people were not on social media within the law enforcement community. But I think that once people look at the benefits of it, they'll also understand that it is scalable. If you don't have a lot of resources, then you can do what you can do. And a little bit, in some ways, can be a lot better than no presence. So it is scalable. You know, there's no way that a police department that has 10 people could do the work of, let's just say, the Seattle Police Department, that has a whole public information division. So they just have to weigh that individually, and again, we can provide assistance and training. The training that the IACP provides goes from, you know, an officer or a department where there's the chief, and he or she is also the patrol officer and the CSI, to a mega LA-sized police department.
I could add to that if you'll allow me to.
Yeah, sure.
I think the model is different. I think, as the chief said, you know, if you're Seattle, you have a different model. It's a little more centralized. The agencies I'm working with, I'm trying to decentralize it. But I think when you're a smaller agency, it's an argument for using social media. Because once you get over that learning curve, that hump of having to learn how do you tweet, and you know, you have a few aha moments where somebody handed you a suspect when you didn't, you know, when you were really short-staffed, and all of a sudden the citizens found him for you. You start to realize this is good stuff for me. If you use it right, you can actually become more efficient, and that 10-man and woman department can be very, very much more efficient than they had been without social media.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all very much, and I'd like to ask my fellow task force members to join me in thanking the panel.